The Inside the Birds podcast you can get on all podcasting platforms. Just search Inside the Birds on the YouTube channel, and you can get more from this man right here, Geoff Mosher, who is back for another edition of Football at 4 as the Combine is going on. There's a lot of NFL news, notes, rumors, and at the top of those news, notes, and rumors, Geoff Mosher seems to be the Tush push. That is the big topic of conversation about everywhere right now. I want to get your thoughts on whether or not you believe the play is legal and fair. Should it be something that the league does look into?
Well, that's a great question, Mike. And if the people who don't like the Tush push and want it outlawed, their best case would probably be to go like deep into the rule book. I heard you guys talking about it earlier. I think you guys were, where there is some sort of blurry gray area on whether or not you're allowed to propel somebody forward, right? You definitely can't pull, but there's some gray area about propelling somebody else forward and causing an obstruction for the defense. And I would add onto that, there's some gray area in the idea of forward motion, because a lot of tush pushes, you get into the scrum and there have been a lot of stalemates, but then at the last second, the push either lets you pick up the extra yard or extra yards. Whereas if it's a run, we talked about this on the podcast this morning, me and Adam. Let's say you run an outside zone to the right, Barkley carries the ball. He's met immediately by a linebacker sort of right at the line of scrimmage, and then they start kind of stalemating. They will blow the whistle for forward motion a lot of times if there's no further traction. And that's really hard to do when you see a scrum of people. So I think that if you're against the tush push and you're trying to make the best case, you can use those two examples of the legality or the irregular enforcement of it, like the whole pass interference thing where they weren't really enforcing it at one point with hand usage on corners past 10 yards. And that they never said they changed the rule, right? They only said that they were going to reinforce the rule. Same thing with the RPOs and ineligible linemen downfield. When RPOs really took the league, the Eagles were one of the first teams to really exploit it and use it. And then as they got into the offseason and realized that teams were kind of getting away with some things, they cracked down on it, but it was never something new. They just said they were reinforcing it.
Yeah,
so those would be areas I think that they look into discussing.
Yeah, the thing that I have said, Geoff, is I just feel like to have 2 or 3 offensive players aiding your momentum forward, I just don't find that to be fair. I think that it gives the offensive team an unfair advantage. The defense is not allowed to use leverage. They can't push off of their teammate to try to block field goals or anything, really. So for the offense to have, I rewatched a bunch of the tush pushes. I'm like, all right, let's see what this play really looks like. Some of them Hurts doesn't get touched at all. He just falls forward, and some guys are just kind of standing there in case they need him. The one in the Super Bowl, he had Goddard, Gainwell, Johnny Wilson, all 3 of them almost lifted him up in the air. And he was like crowd surfing across the goal line. And I'm like, that's really kind of not the spirit of the game, I guess, or the rule.
Well, to your point, I think if the NFL wants to do this, if the competition committee has enough traction, which I'm not sure there will be because you've had some people come out to, in the last 24 to 48 hours from other teams that are not in favor of banning the tush push. But what the NFL could do is crack down on certain things you're mentioning that happened during the tush push that have some illegality to it that makes executing the tush push a little bit more difficult. And to your point, where it is a disadvantage of the defense, there was a time when I think you were allowed to sort of propel yourself over the line of scrimmage to block a field goal,
yes.
Right? And then the NFL said you can't do that anymore. That's an unfair advantage. So those are things that I think will be stronger arguments than player safety, which I think you can make the argument without the evidence. I know that.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's no evidence right now of player safety being a problem.
Right. So I wouldn't make it my starting point, but I would point to Frankie Louvu jumping over the pile multiple times and saying, yes, we don't have evidence yet of a lot of injuries because of this, but we don't want to. Let's be proactive on it. If we're going to have players sort of sacrificing their bodies, jumping over piles, in some cases when the ball isn't even snapped and they're landing on their neck or head, I think that that's the route that you would have to go to instead of just saying it's an unsafe play without any evidence to say so. You have to sort of predict what people might be doing in the future to stop it or to continue to do it, as an example, to be proactive.
All right. Yesterday, Howie Roseman, Nick Sirianni both spoke at the NFL Scouting Combine. Roseman said something about the Eagles evolving in how they view their players. This is what Howie Roseman said in Indianapolis yesterday. Jeff, take a listen.
To kind of put us in a box and say, hey, we're not going to play, and I'm not saying that you're saying that we're not going to pay because historically we haven't done that. I mean, part of what we do is evolve and look at things and see how things are affecting our team, how things are affecting the league, and seeing our place in that.
So what is this evolution that Howie Roseman is referring to?
Well, it's probably a number of things. First of all, they signed Saquon Barkley to a pretty big running back contract in the offseason, which is something the Eagles have not typically done in the Howie Roseman era at all, which is signing a free agent running back to big bucks right now. And I'm sure a lot of people are going to listen to what Howie just said, knowing what he did with Saquon, and extrapolate that going forward to Zach Bond. Will he spend market value on Zach Bond? So I think that it's fair to say, look, we know the Eagles want to re-sign Zach Bond, and they know he's going to make a lot more than the $3 million that he made last year. Adam and I have reported this. We've been told that if Howie could sort of give himself a do-over on the TJ Edwards thing, he'd probably do it. He never even made TJ an offer. I think a couple of weeks ago I told you he did, but I was mistaken. He never made TJ an offer. I think one thing you can probably go to sleep at night feeling is that the Eagles will at least make a competitive offer for Zach Bond. I mean, the price may get so it's just not manageable. But whereas in the past, it's a no, it could be a yes with Zach Bond. But I will also say this, Mike. I don't know if Howie intended to do this or was meaning that, but Adam and I talked about in the podcast I dropped this morning. The Eagles used to be a team that was much more to the extremes on their beliefs, whether it was analytical testing, like athletic testing, we must have this, character, we must have this, or, we won't take. There have been a lot of things that have been very predictable about their way of going about getting players. And sometimes it worked, sometimes it hasn't. But they've changed a little bit. I don't think they're as to the extremes on things in the past. For example, when they drafted Landon Dickerson in the second round, right? Remember all the medicals? He had 4 surgeries.
Which is why he was in the second round.
Absolutely. A top 25 prospect on talent alone. And the Eagles took him. And this is not a guy who is an amazing athletic tester. He's a good athlete, but he's a big, mauling offensive lineman who's a great talent for what he does. But he had a medical history, and he wasn't the most freak of nature athlete in the world, and yet the Eagles took him. So I think that was a sign that they were past the days of we're going to pass on DK Metcalf because of a neck thing, or what I'm saying? They're more willing to take the risk there if they really believe that the player is going to be the value that they're getting him at.
Well, do you read what he said, Jeff, as we value tackle, defensive tackle, edge rusher, guard, more maybe than linebacker. But in this instance, we feel we have in-house options, or we feel better about drafting to replace that spot than we do linebacker. So we may get out of our comfort zone and pay the linebacker something maybe we wouldn't have done in the past.
Sure, and they're playing a different defense. And yet another example of how they have been adaptable in their process, Mike, is that ever since they hired Nick Sirianni and went with Jonathan Gannon as a defensive coordinator, they have played these 5-man fronts and 3-4 defensive structures that you never would have imagined the Eagles would have played. Because even after Andy Reid, when they went, Chip Kelly brought the 3-4, but as soon as they got rid of Chip, they went right back to being the 4-3 with Howie Roseman in power, and never did they draft 340-pound nose tackles like Jordan Davis, right? So they've shown you that they are willing to change with the times, to get with the new defensive philosophies of limiting explosive plays and the new defensive fronts, which are more multiple now than they ever were, for the Eagles in the 90s and 2000s. And so linebacker is important for what Vic Fangio does. And Zach Bond in general is a talented player who is a big piece of what they do and a big part of Vic Fangio's defense. So again, I do think, I know they want him back, and it'll just see. The one thing is, where I think the Eagles will always be the Eagles is, if the market just explodes for a player, they're not going to change their valuation of a guy just because the market did. They're going to stick to their guns on that.
All right, here's what else Howie Roseman said. He explained that everything the Eagles do is this. Take a listen.
Everything really is player dependent. When we talk about situations, it depends on the quality of play of the player, the person that we're talking about. And so you don't want to make any exceptions. Obviously, you have to have a vision of how you want your team to look. In the salary cap era, you have a certain number of resources that you can allocate, whether it's money or draft picks. And so whenever you do something, you're taking it from somewhere else. I mean, there's no way at the stage we are with our team that we can do something major without it coming from somewhere else.
All right, that was really in reference to being asked specifically about Myles Garrett. Their name has kind of been involved there. Everybody always puts the Eagles involved with anything major, but it got some fuel on the fire yesterday when Jeremy Fowler from ESPN suggested that the Eagles would be, one, very aggressive as a team in the trade market, and two, if a division rival was interested in Garrett, that Roseman would no way allow that to happen. Now, his answer was kind of diplomatic, but where do you think the Eagles' mindset is on being aggressive in the trade market on a player of that magnitude? Geoff Mosher.
Yep, I think there's a fine line between being aggressive, which they will do, and being unreasonable, which could be the result depending on what the price tag is for both trade and new contract for Myles Garrett. Clearly, they could use a type of, anybody could use a pass rusher like Myles Garrett, let me be clear on that. But the Eagles in particular, who build in the trenches, they're going to go into next year really with Nolan Smith and JSX Hunt as their top two edge rushers. And those guys are really nice emerging talents, but they're not Myles Garrett yet. And who knows what's going to happen to Bryce Huff. So you could say there's a little uncertainty, especially if Brandon Graham retires, at their most important position on defense with what they can get on a year-round basis. Those guys that I mentioned should improve, but they're not necessarily all-pro players like Myles Garrett. So you would imagine the Eagles would want to be aggressive. They will look into it. But again, they have the 32nd pick. Most NFL teams, Mike, will tell you that they don't see 32 first-round prospects in every draft, right? They usually typically see between 17 and 24, depending on the talent level. So the 32nd pick, a lot of teams will view as sort of a second-round talent. So it's not that attractive if you're just bandying the 32 overall pick. Then maybe you get into players. But then also, Mike, the other side of that is if you trade for Myles Garrett, and I think this is what Howie was alluding to, he's going to want a new contract. And he's so good that his contract should be one of the best or highest paid contracts on defense in the NFL. Well, guess what? At this time next year, no matter what happens with the Eagles, as long as Jalen Carter is still Jalen Carter that we just saw this past last year, you and I are going to be talking about Jalen Carter being in line for an extension that's going to make him the highest paid football player, defensive football player in the league, most likely. So can you have two of those at the same time right there next to each other, along with the fact that you've got Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean, and right now Cam Jurgens is available for an extension? That's where Howie was getting into. Well, you got to give here and take there. You're going to pay Zach Vaughn, well, and you're going to extend Cam Jurgens. Well, then money's got to come out of somewhere else. So that's what complicates the matters with Myles Garrett. But again, the Eagles are smart and they're aggressive. If the offer isn't there, if the Browns aren't getting a ton of great offers for Garrett, or if Garrett says, I want to be an Eagle and I'm willing to pay or play on a contract that's not, making me the highest paid defensive player in the league, then the door is always open there.
Well, that's the big thing, is he has been adamant that he wants to play for a Super Bowl contender. He might have to have some concessions as well. You want to play for a Super Bowl contender? Well, we can't afford you at the number that you get from Cleveland, who wins 3 games. So what do you want to do, buddy?
Right. It's been done before. There have been plenty of players, big-name free agent players, who have gone either signed contracts or, been involved in trades and didn't necessarily get their contract reworked and have just to get into a better scenario. So we will see what unfolds over the next few weeks.
Well, what do you make, like the beginning of that forget the Myles Garrett part of it. He said, people around league circles think that they will be the most aggressive team in the league or one of the most aggressive. He actually had one of the most aggressive, if not the most aggressive, in trades this offseason. I'm thinking, where do they need a trade, or what are they looking to trade for, or who on their roster would they trade? Like that comment kind of opened my eyes a little bit.
Well, it could be a trade for, it could be a trading of. Adam and I have talked on the podcast about Dallas Goedert, a very good player who's been hurt by injuries, especially last year, who comes up on the last year of his deal with no guaranteed money left. And, Mike, you've been around long enough to know that when a good player doesn't have any guaranteed money, which means no security on his contract, that's when he says, hey, we got to do something here. And, the Eagles may not want to do something there with a player, who's getting a little older and has been beat up a lot. So does he have to be traded?
Yeah. Well,
maybe.
It's an ironic situation, Geoff. Talk with Geoff Mosher, Football at 4 from the Inside the Birds podcast. They had 32 a couple years ago. They traded out, moved into the second round, and drafted Goddard when they had Zach Ertz here. They have 32 again. Could they do a very similar thing? Because, as you just said, they might not take a tight end to groom. They might take a tight end to replace.
Well, the key from a couple of years ago that you're referring to when they had 32 was the Ravens wanted that 32nd pick. And we see this occasionally, usually for a quarterback. Like the Ravens took Lamar Jackson there because they want that fifth-year option. They want, especially on a quarterback, an extra year of control at a price that is more manageable than top of the market. The fifth-year option is usually a big pay bump, but it's not necessarily top 5 at your position money. That's why it was really shocking in a way that the Panthers did it last year, traded up to 32, I think, to get Xavier Legette. It's like you really wanted the fifth-year option on a wide receiver that badly, but, that's why the Panthers are the Panthers. But usually teams do that for the quarterback. Will there be a quarterback at 32 overall, 32nd overall this year that someone's going to want to move in? Or is there going to be some other player, again, like Xavier Legette for the Panthers last year, that a team's going to want to be aggressively move into that spot just for the fifth-year option?
Yeah, that's something definitely, the 32, to keep an eye on. We're talking with Geoff Mosher here. Of course, it's Football at 4, the NFL Combine. And as we know, they most likely – at 32, if they stay there, you're looking at the old faithfuls. Defensive line, tackle, edge rusher. Is there another spot, Geoff Mosher, you would say I wouldn't be surprised if they invested in round number 1 at 32? Or even traded up for? I don't know.
Yeah, I would say tight end and offensive line are never – well, offensive line we know is never a surprise with the Eagles, and depending on what happens with Becton, even though they have Steen there, they are always drafting for the future at that position, so that wouldn't surprise me. Tight end for the reasons we just talked about, although I'm not sure at 32 the value will be there. But, Mike, one thing that we should talk about is what is the Eagles' plan for Cooper DeJean? Is it to keep him as that power versatile slot nickel, or is it to move him outside, which is where when they drafted him, they eventually figured he would go? Let's just assume for logic's sake that Darius Slay isn't back. That opens up the hole or the opportunity there for Cooper DeJean to move outside. And then you're looking at needing to get another nickel. But if you want to keep him at nickel because he's a big part of your sim pressure package, your run defense, just like having an extra sort of linebacker out there, the way he's so physical to play against the tight ends, then you might want to look for another outside corner. And as well as anybody, it's hard to find those really good outside corners on late day 2 or day 3. Usually those are day 1, day 2 guys.
Let me get your opinion on this. How valuable does a guy like Vic Fangio see what DeJean did this year and say, I don't want to have to replace that. I want to keep that guy because what he gave us made it so difficult for teams to be able to throw in the flats, seams, the way they like to play their defense. What he did as a slot made it so difficult for teams. So does Vic Fangio say, I actually value him more as a slot guy? And then they have, Rodgers, Ringo, all of those guys that were here. Do they look at those guys, or do they draft another outside corner as a possible guy that we're talking about at 32 or trade up for?
Yeah, so great question. I've actually spoken to a lot of coaches and NFL personnel about this over the years, not just about Cooper, but in general, for a similar situation. At first, I wouldn't be surprised if Vic marched into Howie Roseman's office and said, you better get another punt returner on this team, or you and I are brawling because there's no way this kid's returning punts for next year and putting himself in harm's way like he did all year long. But the answer that I normally get from personnel and coaches when I ask a question like that is, well, tell me what my options are. So I would say the Eagles and Vic Fangio love what Cooper DeJean brings to that nickel spot. And when you run sim pressures the way Vic does, which is, dropping an edge and rushing a second level defender, he's perfect. He's really good at that. And it's hard to do that from the outside corner spot because you're much further away from the quarterback, right? So you don't really see a whole lot of outside cornerback blitzes in any defense, let alone a Vic Fangio defense. So, but if there is the type of player available in round 1, round 2, who knows, free agency, who plays the nickelback spot physically, who can carry out those opportunities and demands that Vic Fangio asks, and you have the opportunity to move Cooper outside, then you do it. If you don't, you try to re-sign Isaiah Rodgers, maybe stick him outside and keep Cooper in the slot. It all just depends on what's available.
All right, Geoff Mosher, we have a lot happening this week with the Combine, and, of course, we'll have more on Football at 4. The Inside the Birds podcast is out. You can check that out as well with Adam and Jeff, and, of course, we'll have plenty tomorrow on the NFL Draft, the Combine, with Andrew, who will be joining us for Football at 4. Looking forward to all of the draft process. Don't forget, the NFL free agency opens on March the 10th. So we are closing in on that, and we'll have it all covered here on Football at 4. Thanks, buddy.
You got it, Mike. Take care.
All right, Geoff Mosher, everybody. It's Football at 4, powered by the Inside the Birds podcast and InsideTheBirds.com.